Yes, the whole issue of blood is an interesting one, because there is a food that is specifically made out of blood. So it's early morning here in Australia. So would you like a big British breakfast, otherwise known as a full English? Could you eat that in terms of the biblical laws? Well, the answer is yes, you can, except for one thing: the blood pudding. Now, if you are a Scotsman, you might like to go out on a haggis hunt and slay a haggis. Well, only joking, but anyway, can you eat haggis in the light of what we've discussed about biblical biology and the changes that have happened in diet over the history of the world? So we can even expand that out. Can you eat black pudding or these various other types of blood sausages? And we found out from someone who wrote into the Ask site about a dish called chocolate meat, which is a Filipino dish, and it is actually where you cook things in blood. And the answer is no. And it's not because of a biological reason, it is because of a biblical reason. Now, we can go back into the Old Testament, and in the law of Moses, there are quite strict rules about eating blood. No person among you shall eat blood. Now, neither shall any stranger who sojourns away. So, in other words, even the people who were from outside of Israel but living within Israel weren't supposed to eat blood. And that's an important point, that if you want to live in God's culture, as it were, God's nation, you had to obey God's laws. And God goes on and gives some more specific details about how to prepare animals for in order to eat them. So there's no biblical mandate for vegetarianism now. It's a choice that you may have if you live in an environment where there are good, nutritious plants. But it's not something that we can impose on other people on the basis of the Bible. But going back to blood, in the New Testament, there's also teaching about blood, where the apostles were asked, well, how do we help the Gentiles in terms of how they should live? What rules should they live by? And for the Jews, this was a case of, well, what do we eat now? Because food laws were very much embedded in the law of Moses. For the Gentiles, they had to struggle with how do we free ourselves from the pagan gods, and the pagan gods and the worship of the pagan gods was very much taken up with what they should eat as well. And so the apostles gave this teaching that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. So this was the summary of how they should live and what they should eat. Bible's very practical, talks about all sorts of things, not just sort of spiritual, emotional sorts of things. And so what happened was the apostles' teaching on diet didn't go back to Eden, and it didn't go back to Moses. It actually went back to Noah, because Noah was told that, yes, you may eat every moving, living thing, but you were not to eat the blood, because the life was in the blood. And so let's go back to practical details. What about what we eat now? Can you eat steak? Yes, you can. And meat processed in a modern day abattoir does have the blood drained out. So that fits with the apostles' teaching. Now, can you eat blue steak? This is where we get to the bit about, well, it looks like it's got blood in it, even though it's called blue steak. And basically, blue steak is steak that's hardly been cooked at all. It's effectively raw. Yes, you can, because that red fluid is not actually blood. There are other iron-containing proteins within flesh, within animal flesh, and one in particular is myoglobin, and it's an iron-containing protein that's specific to muscle cells. We need to, which enables the muscle cells to store oxygen. and it's what makes red meat red. They have a lot of myoglobin in them, but also white meats also have myoglobin. So yes, you can eat your steaks effectively raw if that's what you fancy them, if that's what you like. You're not eating blood, so you don't need to fear that you are disobeying the biblical mandate. It does actually all fit when you put it, again, if you put it into the proper history of the world and what God's instructions are, what the instructions were to Moses, and then what the instructions are to the church through the apostles.
The important part here was the apostles went back to Noah's time and took the teaching that God gave Noah, because you and I still live in a post-flood world. It's certainly post-Edenic, it's post-fall, but the biggest impetus and the biggest controlling factor is the new weather that came in. You will see summer, you'll see winter, you'll have rain, you'll have heat, you'll have dry. That's the world we live in, the one that Noah would live in. And what I find really interesting is the number of Christians, particularly those influenced by the Levitical rules for the Jews on eating pork, eating monkeys, or anything like that. You will notice when God gave Noah permission to eat meat, he did not exclude any animals, right? There's no pigs excluded. There's no monkeys excluded. Noah was told he could eat anything that moved. He just was not to eat the blood. And that's the position that the apostles took, because the Holy Spirit directed them. They needed to tell this to the pagans. Now, I don't know if you've eaten raw meat. No. Yes, I have, because I wanted to experiment on one thing. Does it taste any different than cooked meat? And the answer is not much at all. It's got a different texture. And often the texture is what we like, rather than the ooey gooey, soft, fleshy taste of stringy meat. It's the texture that changes when you cook it, not the flavor greatly. Some of you who like sushi will have already noticed that, when you get your raw pink salmon that's not cooked, the taste is pretty much the same as cooked salmon, but the texture is quite different. So again, it's important when you say, what should I be eating? No, please don't become a Levitical. You can eat this on that day, you can eat something else, but make sure you say, this is God's general rule for the world that has descended from Noah, the world that is post-Noahic, the animals that got off Noah's Ark. God knew how many there would be. God knew what we'd do to them with our sinful desire. In fact, I suspect that in Australia, with our new display we have on Aboriginals and the history of Australia, one reason the giant animals disappeared, giant kangaroos, giant lizards, etc., is that they were the easiest to hunt, right? Particularly if you live in a country which is drying out, which has started to do after the flood. They would have killed off the big ones first, leaving goannas that are this big, whereas they used to be 10 or 15 meters long. So there's all sorts of implications here.